All right, gang, today we're going to talk about two different sets of absolutist regimes. The first one we're going to talk about is in Russia, and the second one in another video is going to be all about England and how absolutism worked in England, or actually didn't work very well in England. Well, so start out, let's talk about Russia. First thing you need to understand about Russia is that it historically has been separated from the West. There's a really great map in your textbook that illustrates how Russia really started out as this tiny little kingdom around Moscow and grew to expand over time. The Russian czars, or kings as they are, the Russian monarchs have constantly wanted to be more connected to the West because they understood that that would give them wealth, that would give them power, and that would allow them influence on the world. So Russia historically has kind of been in this weird position of being Western and European, but not really Western and not really European. And so that's going to play a pretty major impact on the way that their government rules, really from the 1500s, what we're talking about right now, 1533 or so, and on. So let's talk about the absolutist roots in Russia. First of all, there's this guy, Ivan IV. Now, if you've ever heard about Ivan the Terrible, this is Ivan the Terrible from Russia. Ivan came to power when he was 3 years old in the year 1533. Okay? Ivan, generally speaking, initially was a good guy. But then he turned into a really bad ruler in about the year 1560 or so. Started his bad period when his wife died. Most people think that Ivan was schizophrenic. Okay? This guy was legitimately crazy. And so all through during his reign, and even when he was a little kid, he took over at the age of 3. He couldn't really rule, so he had to rely on a group called the boyars. The boyars were the Russian nobility. And so during this time, both his good period prior to 1560 and after that, after 1560, he had a lot of conflict with these boyars. When Ivan died, he had actually already killed his oldest son, who was supposed to be his heir, and then that left his second son, his youngest son, to become the king. Well, his youngest son wasn't very good, and so Russia fell into a lot of infighting. If you're curious, by the way, he died in the year 1581. And so he ruled for a long time, 50 some odd years, but when he died, he didn't leave a good heir. And so the boyars constantly were infighting. Eventually, those noblemen actually elected, and that's important to note, that the nobility actually elected a king. They elected a czar, a ruler amongst themselves. And this guy, his name is Michael Romanov. Michael Romanov emerged as the new czar, the elected king of Russia. And he took power in 1613. And it's his family that carries on and takes over. It's the Romanov family that rules from 1613 until 1917, 1918, the year of the Russian Revolution, when the communists take over. So they rule, that one family rules for 300 years. Well, there are several kings. Well, Michael leaves an heir. Michael got married, and he obviously had children. And so eventually, coming to power is his son Peter. Okay, there are lots of ins and outs and a little bit of it there, but the only one you really need to know about is Peter. So his family eventually has Peter the First. Peter becomes the Great. When Peter was young, he ruled with his brothers and sisters until he eventually, they would like play these war games together until he eventually either had them killed, some don't really know about that, or they died. But eventually he became sole ruler. But while he was still ruling jointly with his brothers and sisters, he took a trip to the West. Peter the first thing you need to understand about Peter the First is he was 6 foot 8 inches tall. Okay? Even during the Middle Ages, or 1600s as the case may be, late 1600s, this is a big guy. This is a giant of a man. Today he was a giant of a man. Now, depending on the accounts you read, I've read several different ones. Some people say he was very large. Some people say he was actually kind of really skinny for his height, so he looked really weird. But regardless, you can't hide a guy like this. So what he did was he took a trip to Europe, and he dressed up like a commoner on this trip out west. And what he wanted to do, his whole goal, was to learn how to westernize. Okay, and so his entire goal of making this trip to Europe, to Western Europe, was to learn how to be like them, because that was Russia's goal, was to become like the Europeans, was to be just like him. And so he took this trip. Well, he finally came back in 1689. Okay, he took his trip in the 1680s, came back in 1689, and he ruled alone in Russia by himself from 1689 to 1725. So he's ruling alone. So here are a couple of things that he did. He had a couple of main goals. One, he wanted access to the sea. He wanted to establish a warmer water seaport, okay, and so he built and moved the capital from Moscow all the way up to St. Petersburg, Russia. Now, if you look at St. Petersburg, it's on the northern coast, it's on the Baltic Sea, it's a cold coast. Here's what you also need to know about St. Petersburg and the seaport that he wanted. He wanted it to have easier access to the west. One, he wanted to trade. Two, he wanted access to Western universities. Three, he wanted to build a fleet where he could trade and have a navy that could conquer either the world or defend itself. Okay, he wanted to be Western. Ask me tomorrow, and I will tell you a really great story about Peter and this group of guys that he had that helped to do that. Okay? Two, he wanted to modernize the military. Just as I said yesterday, he wanted to expand the military greatly. He wanted to grow the military, and he did that. One of his modern methods of modernization was growing the military. Under his rule, let me check so I can see it, the army grew to 200,000 men. So he's got this huge army, this huge military that's now a lifetime military, not, hey, we're fighting a war right now or need defense right now. Come here, all you farmers, come help us. This is a professional military. They wore Western clothes. They fought with Western tactics. That's the line, line up and shoot each other kind of thing. All right? And so he's westernizing and modernizing them. Okay? Third goal of Peter was to westernize. In pretty much all things, he wanted to be like the West. So this meant a lot of different things. One, it meant that they had to wear Western clothes. All the nobility were forced to wear Western clothes. They were forced to shave their beards. Russians traditionally, if you take a look here at Ivan here, you see that he's got that long beard. Well, that's a Russian thing. They wore these thick wool jackets, fur lined, because it's cold. Russia's very far north. It's very cold. So he stopped that. Western clothes, Western facial hair. He also brought women into the court, women into social life. He introduced the potato, which becomes a staple of the Russian diet. And so those are just a few of the things that he did to modernize Russia. He also started Russia's first newspaper and edited the first issue itself. So he really wanted to be like the West. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about St. Petersburg. Just like Louis, Peter created his own Versailles. Now, his Versailles was in his city of St. Petersburg. Well, this was really the first building that they built in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was basically in a swamp in the north. It was cold, it was muddy. During the summers, it was hot and muggy. And in order to build St. Petersburg, Peter and his army forced anywhere from 25,000 to 100,000 serfs, those are the people working the land, to peasants, to go build St. Petersburg. And the estimates are that huge numbers of them died. Your textbook says 25 to 100,000 serfs died simply building that. So he sacrificed his people to build his grand palace at Versailles. And he got that. Again, ask me tomorrow and I'll tell you a really cool story about this. So St. Petersburg, the whole city, was his Versailles. Coming several years after Peter is Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great ruled Russia again with an iron fist, and she continues the modernization. But Peter, let me go back, but she extends it. One, she wants a warm water port. She actually gets and wages war in the south on the Black Sea to gain a port on what's called the Sea of Azov. So they create a port there. And two, she actually makes all of the nobility learn and speak French. So she throws out the Russian language from the court, from the nobility, and says, nope, you know what? We're all going to speak French. We're going to learn ballet because that's what they do in France, and we want to be like them. So that's absolutism in Russia. To review, its roots are very similar conflict in the younger days with the boyars or the nobility. A king comes to power. There's conflict in his youth. He takes a trip out west. This is what makes him unique, to learn about Western ways, and this includes shipbuilding. He worked for an entire year in a Dutch shipyard. Okay, so he comes back to Russia from 1689 to 1725 and rules. His three goals were establish a seaport, which he also establishes a school for navigation, just like Henry the Navigator. 2, modernize and expand the military. Large army is an aspect or characteristic of absolutism. And westernize, become more like the West. He built his own Versailles in St. Petersburg. A lot of people died building his dream. And again, really cool story tomorrow. Ask me about. And his heir, coming eventually, several years later, is Catherine the Great. She actually was married to Peter III, Peter's grandson. Peter III died. Some people say she killed him or had him murdered, rather. And she rules absolutely as well, forcing the nobility to learn French, bringing ballet to Russia, and that's absolutism in Russia.